Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to take a look at a very interesting event that took place in 1941, and that was the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. My guest is an expert on this topic. Dr. Takuma Melber is a Japanese-German historian. He studied medieval and modern history and ancient history and sociology at the universities of Mainz and Zurich. One of his most recent books is titled Pearl Harbor. Dr. Takuma Melber, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you for having me.
I appreciate you being with me today. This is not ancient history, but it's certainly history that goes back almost 80 years. But let's talk about your book. What was the main theme of your book? And we'll get into the specifics as we go through the discussion.
Yeah, so the main theme of my book is obviously the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. And I'm aware of the fact that many books have been published in English in the US about the Pearl Harbor attack. And my approach is a bit different. So I'm using much more Japanese sources. So I'm presenting the Pearl Harbor attack much more from a Japanese point of view, so to speak. So many of my protagonists are Japanese. Yeah.
I see. Now you're fluent in Japanese, German, English, and probably many other languages too. So you certainly have an advantage there. Talk a little bit about what were the relationships leading up to December 7th? What were there tensions? Obviously there were tensions between the US and Japan, but what were some of the major areas of disagreement, and what was the flashpoint that caused the Japanese to attack the US Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor?
Yes, yeah. If we would like to understand the Pacific War in general, yeah, and the Pearl Harbor attack, then we have to look closer at the Second Sino-Japanese War. Yeah, we can't understand the Pacific War without looking closer at the Sino-Japanese War, the Second Sino-Japanese War, and 1937. So you all are familiar with the so-called Nanjing massacre and the atrocities committed by the Japanese military in China, and the Western powers, the US as well, of course, yeah, were protesting against this. And the US had also an interest in China, yeah, in continental China as some kind of a future market, yeah. So this was in danger because of the Japanese invasion in a way. And the Western powers in general did not accept the Japanese as being on the same level, yeah, as being on the same level as a great power in the Far East, yeah. So if we look on Japanese military history in the early 20th century, after the Russo-Japanese War, the First World War, etc., it's a history full of Japanese military success, yeah. But seen from a Japanese perspective at the time, that the Japanese result, the result of this success was not that good, not that high. Yeah, so the Japanese government was aiming for more. Yeah, and this was against American interest in Asia. Yeah, was against American interest in Asia, and the Americans had an interest in stopping the war in continental China. Yeah, and for stopping the war, the embargo was important. Yeah, so it was in a sense some kind of economic warfare already going on. Yeah,
that's right. There was a trade embargo, as I recall. The US had applied to Japan, and of course Japan is a country that's resource poor. They don't have a lot of internal resources, so that
exactly,
certainly
yeah.
puts strains on them. I'm curious though, the US, you had an isolationist feeling in the United States to not get involved in the European theater in fighting the Germans and the Italians, Mussolini and Hitler and those folks. Yet, as soon as the December 7th, 1941 attack occurred, then President Franklin Roosevelt went to the Congress and basically got involved in World War II. Had the Japanese taken that into consideration? Did they realize that what they did would probably, I'm guessing, in all probability, pull the United States into World War II?
I think the question is, who are the Japanese now? Yeah, so do you have the Japanese politicians and the military, meaning commanding officers in mind, or much more common, the common Japanese on the ground, so to speak? If we talk about the common Japanese on the ground, average Japanese people, then maybe not. Yeah, but I'm pretty sure that the Japanese government did know what they are doing at that time. Yeah, and Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, so the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor, behind the Pearl Harbor attack, he was actually warning we should not start a war against the US, because that's a war we can't win. We can't never ever win. Yeah, but nevertheless, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and the US Pacific Fleet.
Yes, right. I remember that he was famous for saying that. A lot of people have questioned, historians in the United States and elsewhere too, I'm sure. They wondered, they asked the question, did the US's intelligence fail, or did high-level people in the United States government actually know that there may be some type of an attack on Pearl Harbor, maybe not to the degree or the severity of what actually occurred, but some type of attack on Pearl Harbor. In fact, some have even speculated, they said, did President Franklin Roosevelt actually have advance warning or think that it was going to be attacked? Did the Japanese ever comment on that, or have you seen anything to prove or disprove that?
Yeah, I mean, there was lots of warning, lots of rumors before the Pearl Harbor attack, and also warning that the Japanese could attack Pearl Harbor, maybe, yeah, but not only Pearl Harbor, maybe Singapore or any other harbor also, yeah, in the Asia Pacific region of the Western powers, so to speak. So Manila, for example, as well. Yeah, and as you said, the Second World War was also a war of intelligence, yeah, of intelligence and counterintelligence. And there was a journalist, an American journalist, who wrote a quite famous book in the mid 90s. His name is Robert Stinnett, yeah, and yeah, his book is based on some kind of conspiracy theory, in my opinion. Yeah, so his argument is that Roosevelt knew everything about the Pearl Harbor attack in advance. He got all information, but that's just not true. Yeah, the cryptographs of the U.S. Army and Navy had access to the diplomatic codes of the Japanese, but not to the military code at that time, or not that much. Yeah, so the cryptographs, the US cryptographs, have been unable to read everything. Yeah, so the question is, what capacity had the cryptographs on the US side to translate lots of traffic, lots of communication. Yeah, and the telegram in which a message was given that the Japanese will attack Pearl Harbor was translated after the Pearl Harbor attack, and this was something which was Stinnett overlooking. Yeah, which was Stinnett overlooking. Yeah, yeah.
That's very important. Of course, today we look back over the, like say, almost 80 years now, and we look at the conflicts that have existed. A lot of historians, a lot of UN watchers are saying one of the main reasons we've not had another world war is because of the United Nations. Now, we can't prove it, we can't disprove it, but the fact that countries do come together, 193 countries come together under one roof to talk about their problems and hopefully to resolve them peacefully. There have been a lot of isolated wars, internal civil wars, that type of thing, but still no major catastrophe like World War I or World War II. And of course, as I mentioned, one of the reasons that a lot of historians and foreign policy analysts express is the fact that the United Nations exists. We didn't have the United Nations in 1941. Is there some way, could there have been better communication between the Japanese and the US government? I'm talking about the Japanese government and the United States government to have averted this conflict, or was it pretty much set in stone once the sanctions were applied against the Japanese and the Japanese were involved in war with China?
Yeah, I mean, if we look closer at the Pearl Harbor attack and the story of the Pearl Harbor attack, yeah, then so if you start reading my book, yeah, then the first almost 100 pages are about diplomatic negotiations going on in Washington and in Tokyo, and so they were communicating a lot, the U.S. and the Japanese, but maybe the wrong persons were talking to each other. Yeah, so maybe the U.S. president should have talking to should talk to the emperor directly. Yeah, the Japanese direct emperor or the prime minister or so. Um, and of course, communication is very, very important always, and also some kind of mediating powers are very important. So that's why the United Nations are that important in our time. Yeah,
Mm.
and I mean, there was a similar organization in existence that time, which the Japanese, as we all know, left. Yeah, and there were, yeah, two real blocks at the time, political and ideological blocks, yeah, the Axis and the Allies, yeah, already
Right.
in existence with the signature of the Tripartite Pact in 1940. So yeah.
It certainly was, and they communication wasn't the best, to put it mildly, amongst any of them. Just very briefly, what was the role of Emperor Hirohito? What role did he play in this?
Yeah, in my opinion, he had a decisive role. Yeah, we have to keep in mind that he was the supreme commander of the Japanese army and navy at that time, and he had the last word. Yeah, so he made actually the decision for war, for attacking Pearl Harbor in early December 1941. So, and his younger brother, Prince Takamatsu, for example, yeah. He was voting for avoiding a war with the United States of America, but this was something what Hirohito neglected. Yeah, neglected, and we have to keep in mind that Hirohito was comparatively young at the time. Yeah, so he was 40 years old, unexperienced regarding wars and warfare. Yeah, so he became emperor in 1926. Yeah, so not that much experience in wars and warfare. Of course, the Second Sino-Japanese War, but that's all, so to speak. Yeah, um, and I mean, the Americans made, in my personal opinion, yeah, or in my opinion as historian, one major mistake after the war. They missed to bring him to trial, yeah, after the war. So yeah. So this is there are still debates going on about the role of the emperor, and some are saying, okay, he was only a puppet of the Japanese military. Others are saying, like me, others are saying that he knew more or less everything. Yeah.
There have been strong opinions on both sides on that. I've read quite a bit about them. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer, you like our shows, and you'd like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at the April 7, 1941 attack by the Japanese government on Pearl Harbor. My guest is an expert on this topic. Dr. Takuma Melber is a Japanese-German historian. Dr. Melber studied medieval and modern history and ancient history and sociology at the University of Mainz and Zurich. One of his most recent books is titled Pearl Harbor. Dr. Melber, we could fill hours and hours talking about all the events, but one other item that's gotten a lot of debate has been the dropping of atomic weapons. The only atomic weapons ever to be dropped were by the United States on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. How important do you think that was as far as ending the war early? Should they not have been dropped because they were crimes against humanity? But at that time, civilians weren't even considered. I mean, we saw the the strafe bombing that took place in Europe and that type of thing by both sides. But how do you see that those detonations as impacting the end of the war?
Yeah, I mean, it's for me, it's crystal clear. Yeah, this was a decisive moment. Yeah, and the dropping the atomic bomb, so meaning both bombs, quickened the end of the Second World War. Definitely, yeah, definitely. And from I would say the second drop of the atomic bomb, meaning on Nagasaki, even the last Japanese understood, okay, now we are at the end of the war. Yeah, we have lost the war, and we have to surrender. Yeah, we must surrender now. However, we should not overlook, maybe much more important for the Japanese military and government, was that the Soviet Union entered the war and invaded Manchuria between the first and the second drop of the atomic bomb. So maybe for the Japanese government and the politicians, this was much more important, a much more decisive moment, so to speak, because many politicians and military personnel or commanding officers were hoping for some kind of negotiations and a good solution, meaning a diplomatic solution for the Japanese via the Soviet Union. Yeah, and this hope was gone with the Soviet invasion of Manchuria.
Exactly, it certainly is, and this is another issue that's been debated uh, umpteen times over. Well, let me ask you as a sort of a closing question. We always want to try to defuse the tendency to go to war. We talked a minute ago about the positive role the UN has played in this area. There are tensions right now between, well, let's just say the U.S. and China, between the U.S. and Iran, between South Korea, North Korea, and the United States. What lessons can we learn from this, or what suggestions would you have to offer to help these countries to enhance their communication, to promote communication, better understanding of each other's particular points of view, to avoid any type of conflict? And there could be nuclear conflict, especially since North Korea and China and the United States, all three have nuclear weapons.
Yes, I agree, and you're absolutely right. And I can see this danger as well in our time. Um, I mean, we should keep in mind, I'm no politician, of course, yeah, but we should keep in mind that starting a war is always last resort, yeah, is last resort. And we should aim for peace, a peaceful solution always. Now we are living in a different time, and I think we all agree that in the 1940s, the view on Asian nations was different, yeah, meaning the Western view on Asian nations. So in my opinion, the Americans were in a way underestimating the Japanese and the Japanese military and the Japanese military power. So in a way, looking down, and so also for racist reasons in a way, yeah. So racism played a major role at the time. So they just did not and never ever expect that the Japanese would and could attack the US Army and Navy, and never ever the US Pacific Fleet. So meaning the heart, the naval heart in the Pacific region of the US. Yeah. Very important is in our time to keep negotiating as long as possible, as much as possible. Yeah. And warfare has changed, as you said as well. Yeah. So in 1941, no power had access to nuclear weapons. Time has changed, and now if you start a war as a nuclear power, a war can quite easily become in a short period of time a real world war. Yeah, with major and long consequences for the whole world. Yeah, and that's what needs to be avoided. Yeah.
Mhm. And you you alluded to it a moment ago. It's easy to start a war. It's very difficult to stop a war. And inevitably, if you talk to the people who have been in wars, very few will say, this is really a glorious event. Gee, I wish we could have more of them. We could all come out and get wonderful medals and that type of thing. Most of them have just unanimously said it's a travesty. It should never have happened, and you need to try to downplay going to war every chance you get. And again, as we discussed earlier, that's one of the reasons that even with the United Nations, with its shortcomings, and it does have shortcomings, anytime you have 193 governments in the General Assembly, you know you're going to have disagreement and conflict from time to time. But the point is that these countries can come together and talk about their problems and hopefully resolve them peacefully. And of course, that's the first goal of the United Nations, is to eliminate the scourge of war. And one could only have hoped that the UN would have been there in 1941 instead of, fortunately, it was created in June, on June 26, 1945, but it was a little bit after the Second World War. But Dr. Takuma Melber, I want to thank you and congratulate you on this very interesting book, and to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you, Mr. Miller.
My pleasure. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.